Part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hi, everybody, and good day, and welcome to the Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Scott Sabol.
And I'm the other one, John Sabol.
So we really have a really special day here. By the way, before I get to it, don't forget, watch us, listen to us on social media. You can check us out too on Apple and on Spotify and all your major platforms for podcasts. If you're even at work and you're on your PC, just go to Press Play Podcast. You'll find Sabol Brothers on the Baseline, and you can listen to us. And we got a whole huge library now. I don't know what episode we're up to. We've been doing this now for a couple of years, John. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, this is episode 39. Can you believe
39?
it? 39.
Wow, I wonder what 50 is going to bring us coming down the line. So we really have a real special episode today. This is on the Dome Stadium Corporation. Now, if you're under the age of 35, you're wondering, what are you even talking about? Dome Stadium? I know we've heard about it in the news recently, but what's the Dome Stadium Corporation, and what was that? And what was that for Cleveland? If you were around in the 1980s, it was something that didn't happen. Let's just put it that way. John, it said, and we're really going to go into why that didn't happen. And we're going to also go into and talk with a couple of people who were really heavily involved with trying to get that off the ground, and how that kind of evolved into what we currently go to each and every time we go to downtown Cleveland for sporting events.
And it's interesting because, the Cavs and then Indians both got two new facilities while the Browns did not.
Right.
Eventually they moved. And we'll touch on all of that, as well as the rumored in the 80s, before I was even born, Scott, of the Indians potentially moving out of town. Mm-hmm. But really how that decade of the mid-80s to the mid-90s completely changed the face of Cleveland, but also the plans that they had in place by some government entities to put a dome stadium somewhere in Cleveland that obviously did not happen, which is interesting because now the talk in town is the Browns. Are they going to get a new stadium? Are they going to renovate their current stadium? So it's funny how it's all cyclical here 30, 40 years later. Right.
So I'm going to give you kind of a chronology here. The Dome Stadium Corporation roughly started in the mid-80s, 1984, 85, 86. And by the time 1994 rolled around, there was no Dome Stadium. But of course, there was what we call the Gateway Project. And that's, of course, Progressive Field and Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. So in a span of roughly 9 to 10 years, we went from Dome Stadium to what we see today. So we have two guests that were heavily involved with, one of them was a failed project, and one of them was the current project. We're going to start with our first guest right now. Cleveland native, graduate of Lakewood High School, and former governor of Ohio and former U.S. ambassador to India, Mr. Richard Celeste. Governor, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon about our discussion about the Dome Stadium Corporation in Cleveland. It's always
good to be
hot
with
topic,
you.
Especially, it's always a hot topic. And so, Mr. Celeste, if I can refer to you as that, or former Mr. Governor, however you'd like.
You can call me whatever you want. I've been called all sorts of things, Scott. So. Most people call me
I'm going to
Dick.
set this up. That's fine. So I'm going to set this up with some brief history here, especially for our listeners who weren't alive in the 1980s and obviously don't remember the 60s and 70s. And you go back to the 60s and 70s, early 80s. The Cleveland Indians were extremely bad. The Browns were good, but they also kind of were in a drought in the 70s. The Indians threatened to move a bunch of times back in the late 60s. You had owners that just, they didn't have a lot of money. They were cash strapped. There were always these proposals and these threats of the Indians moving. But thank goodness for us, none of them came to fruition. Take us back, first off, even before the 1980s, if you can remember, to the early 1970s. I remember you were lieutenant governor back then. There were talks even more than 50 years ago of the Indians moving or a new stadium being built. What do you remember about those times?
Well, there were always conversations, and I went to the 1940. I still have my ticket from the 1948 World Series game.
Wow,
very
when
cool.
I was there. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember that, and I'm old enough to remember when the team was really terrific, and miss those days, frankly. But one way or another, the team was kept in Cleveland, and I think Steve O'Neill, went as an owner, really never contemplated moving. Although my guess is that he was uneasy with the arrangement around the operation of the stadium, because basically Art Modell controlled that, and the baseball team was sort of the little, I don't want to use this expression, John, but the little brother of the football team, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, the issue really came to a head in 1983 when Steve O'Neill died, and his estate, the question was, well, what do we do with the ball club? And I think at that point it was clear that it could be moved, somebody could buy it and move it. And so the question was, what would it take to keep the team in Cleveland? And in fact, I invited Bowie Kuhn, who was in his last year as commissioner of baseball, and Bobby Brown, who was in his first year as president of the American League, to lunch at the governor's residence in, I suppose, mid-1984. Because I really needed their advice on how the league viewed the sale of the team, a team move, stadium, and all of that. And I invited the mayor of Cleveland, George Voinovich at the time, and I also invited the council president, George Forbes, to come down to that lunch. Forbes came, Voinovich didn't. So we had a probably 2-hour lunch at the governor's residence. Bowie Kuhn was, he's very much a gentleman. He was the sort of, there was a kind of an aristocratic air about him, and he was deeply devoted to baseball. He did most of the talking because Bobby Brown was new in his job. And it was clear that their preference would be ownership that would keep the club in Cleveland. They felt Cleveland was a great city for supporting Major League Baseball, and they liked being there. It was a history. They also felt that the stadium was not, the municipal stadium was not the right place to play ball. And as they were leaving, I raised the question about a dome stadium, and Bowie Kuhn said, we're agnostic on the matter of a dome stadium. That's really up to the community and to the owners and so on. As they were leaving, Bobby Brown took me aside and he said, Governor, baseball's meant to be played outdoors on grass. A dome stadium is not, you do not need a dome stadium to have a professional baseball team. And from a player standpoint, a dome stadium is not as much fun as playing outside. And it was very interesting. I mean, this was kind of an off the record comment. That was it. But in the meantime, the mayor, who had not been part of this conversation, although I reported it to him, and I think it was the county treasurer, I'm not sure, but they were encouraged by Art Modell, I think, to put together an effort to promote a dome stadium paid for with a property tax. And this went on the ballot for, I guess it had been on the ballot. Maybe this is what actually stimulated the conversation or was part of the conversation. That property tax issue lost in May of 1984. And so there was a serious question about, is the community prepared to support this? And I had not endorsed the property tax issue. I felt that wasn't the right way to finance a stadium. And I had ongoing conversations with business leaders in Cleveland about this for the next year or two. The question, and then, Dick Jacobs bought the club in '86, and that was a decision that really was going to keep the team in Cleveland. But part of his decision to buy it was a commitment to build a new stadium. And the question was where and how to create a new stadium. What I did to try to stimulate this and also to make sure that it happened, I asked Tom Chema, who a Cleveland attorney who had come to Columbus had stayed in Cleveland initially to run the lottery commission for me, and then had come to Columbus to chair the Public Utilities Commission for me. And I asked Tom Chema to take the lead in putting together a public-private partnership in Cleveland that could create a stadium. And that's how the Gateway project was organized. Mm-hmm. And so, I think I never was a fan of a dome stadium. I have to admit that. I probably was influenced a bit by what Bobby Brown said to me after this luncheon.
You then get into 1985, and that then parlays into the Dome Stadium Corporation. How did that organization come to be, and how was it different than previous dome stadium ideas and projects, to your knowledge?
There was a lot of maneuvering, I guess, is the kind way to put it, between Art Modell as the owner of the Browns and as the fellow with the master lease for the Cleveland Stadium, and the potential buyer for whoever was going to buy the Indians. Because the way things were arranged, the baseball team had to give Modell's operation a chunk of their parking fees, for example, a chunk of all of the food and beverages money that they made, and they were only drawing 8,000 or 10,000 people in a stadium that seated 75,000, 80,000 on a low day, and 90,000 when you had the football doubleheader in there, right?
Sure.
So I'm not sure exactly whose fingerprints were on the Dome Stadium Corporation. Let me put it that way. And and Chema may have some insight into that, I think, because in the end, Gateway became the vehicle for the stadium development rather than the Dome Stadium Corporation.
When you were talking about the Dome Stadium, what the genesis of our conversation with the Dome Stadium was, real quick history here. I was going through an old filing cabinet at the station, and I was going through some old weather stuff, and I found this packet of information. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. It's in really good condition. Probably Mr. Goddard put it in there because he saved everything, but it was the Civic Committee to develop the Dome Stadium plan. And I have it in front of me, and you have William McDonald as the chairman. You have Mary Boyle. You have, there's a whole bunch of people in here that kind of got the ball rolling. And this is dated May of 1985. And this little packet here, they have everything. When you would look at this as a newspaper or a television reporter, you would think that in 1985, by the end of the decade, you would have some sort of stadium built. This was really well put together, maybe, all on the local level here. So I don't know. It's interesting to look back, Dick, on what could have been back in the mid 80s.
Yeah. The question always was, in the end, how are you going to finance it? Right. And even then, stadiums were not getting built with private money. They needed some combination of public and private resources that would support this. And the private resource might be a long-term lease commitment so that you could cover the financing costs of. And the reason why I asked Chema to step in was because he had the kind of background and a capacity to figure out which business leaders were prepared to really put their muscle behind this, and which ones would be a nice name on a letterhead, but one way or another weren't in a position to really contribute. And in the end, what we put together was a kind of an array of what we referred to as syntaxes at that time, but it was more than that. I mean, I think there were something on rental fee, car rental fees. There are other things that were part of this as well, but it was an effort to put together a package that could get support from the city, the county, all of the elements who needed to be supportive to build the stadium. And of course, as soon as it became evident that we were moving forward, and we made an offer to Art Modell to design a stadium that would be flexible and could be used for football and baseball. And he didn't want that unless he controlled the design and the outcome. Once the new stadium was going to be built and it was clear that the Indians were going to be there, he was ready to move on. I mean,
what was it like working and talking with Art Modell during those times in the 80s when you have these different proposals of how to get the stadiums funded through, syntaxes and other means through the county and through the city, and then ultimately trying to propose ideas to help both parties? And this is obviously before the Indians got Gateway Project underway.
Right. He was always willing to talk. I mean, he was a business guy, and he was always open to a deal, but the deal needed to be one that met his terms, and he was sitting pretty. I mean, he had this arrangement with the city of Cleveland where everything he got from the Indians was gravy on top of the Browns playing in the stadium. Now he had mixed feelings because he was very much a greater Cleveland guy. He grew up in Lorain. His business base was in Lorain. The Indians were in his blood, but in the end, he was a hard-nosed business guy. So when you talk to him, he was always interested in a proposal. He would ask good questions about it. But in the end, the question, you could see what the calculation that was going on is, how is this going to affect my investment and my position here?
Was there ever a talk going back that you can remember from the beginning of this whole Dome Stadium talk back in the early 70s all the way until the mid 80s? Was there ever a talk of putting a dome on the old stadium? And if so, did that get any traction?
Not to my knowledge. I think from a baseball standpoint, the old stadium, the municipal stadium, simply wasn't suited to baseball. I mean, you were too far from the field. You weren't, short of an all-star game or the World Series, you were not going to fill that stadium. You're going to be playing to a half-empty place. And so putting a dome over it, for maybe the 14 or 15 games that it would make a difference in a season. I don't know of any serious evaluation of that. There may have been somebody, it's possible that, a Maletti, for example, who had, Nick was wonderful. He had maybe the boldest imagination of any of the folks who played in professional sports in Cleveland. Nick may have thought about that, but I think anybody who had looked at it would have come to the conclusion that it just wasn't designed in the first instance for baseball.
It's interesting, Dick. And for those who are listening, don't know Nick Maletti, former Cavaliers owner, and we'll get to him in a second. The one thing I was fascinated with when they built Municipal Stadium in the early 30s, the notion that, and it's been debunked over the time now, that they built that to attract the Olympics, which was actually not true at all.
Not true.
Not true.
Yep.
But you go to an intimate ballpark at League Park and go to this massive cavernous stadium. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall back in the, late 20s, early 30s to be like, what are we doing? Like that makes absolutely no sense as to why they would go from something so intimate and beautiful and small that was also getting outdated due to, the invention of the cars,
right.
streetcars going away, sure. And other amenities, to something so massive. It's just like they went from small to massive, but nothing in the middle. And that was before the Browns ever existed. They started playing in 46, and before that they had the Rams.
The Rams. I also went to the 1945 game in which the Cleveland Rams beat the Washington Redskins. Minus, talk about dome. That was -5 degrees when that game was played. The end zones were frozen.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you remember the story about that game, but that game was decided because George Radaman of the Redskins threw a pass. At that time, the goalposts were on the
goal line.
On the goal line,
mm-hmm.
And his pass hit the goalpost, and that was a disputed safety, and the Rams won by 2 points.
Get out of here! I did not know that.
Yeah,
that's incredible. Wow.
I froze. I was 8 years old for that game. I mean, I give away my age, but yeah. So I don't know, but the interesting thing is, I think probably. In that period of time, public works were important. And anytime you had a project that could put people to work, I mean, this is Depression and coming out of that, my guess is that there was some incentive there. I have no idea what the conversation was.
So you mentioned Dick Jacobs. Dick Jacobs buys the Indians. I think it was late 86. I think it was 85 or 86.
86.
How much of an influence did he have on trying to get a new ballpark going? Because you had you mentioned before, the 84 ballot, the public voted that down.
Right.
All these ideas came and went. And, prior to him, the Indians, they might, their time frame here in Cleveland could have been limited anyway. What was his influence on the whole thing?
Well, I think he, once he committed to buying the team, he became the person he had to negotiate with. And whatever plan for the stadium that the civic leaders were going to come up with, including a governor from Cleveland and so on, it had to be something that Dick Jacobs would lease for, an extended period of time. I don't remember exactly, whether it was 20 years or 30 years, some commitment long enough that you could sell bonds and make it work. And and I think he was probably influenced by the success of the new stadium in Baltimore.
I mean, to put this into perspective, we go from, in 1984, you have the bond issue, which failed. You go to 85 and 86, Dome Stadium Corporation, Dick Jacobs buys the team in 86. And then all of a sudden, 4 years later, they have a syntax which is put on the ballot for what would be now known as Gateway, and that narrowly passes by 13,000 votes by the public. So when you look at it in history, a lot happened in the span of 4 or 5 years to go from a dome stadium to what we see when we go to downtown Cleveland. That whole idea of Gateway, did that just gain traction literally overnight?
No, I think that was a conversation. I did not talk to Tom Chema recently about this, so it's not, I don't have a clear recollection, but I asked him to take this on while I was, still governor. So it was in the late 80s. And there was quite a bit of conversation and negotiation with the municipal leaders, because you can't put a tax issue on the ballot if you and expect to succeed unless you have the county and city governments behind it, right? They're affected by whatever kind of tax you put on the ballot. You also, I'm sure there was polling done with folks at that time and so on. So there's I'm sure an interesting conversation with Tom about how the Gateway Corporation was formed, how they, what they considered by way of potential taxes in a package that would be put before the public, how they negotiated with Dick Jacobs. I think there were questions around the site for the stadium that had to be decided, and they were looking at a site that was more down into the flats, maybe. But then there were issues around access by car, parking, things of that kind that became an issue. So there was a whole conversation that went on there, and it may be that between someone like Mary Boyle, who apparently was part of the Dome Stadium Corp, and Chema, who really was the architect, I think, of the Gateway effort. I know he one of the things he wanted from me when he took the job was a commitment for the governor to come up whenever he needed to roll me out and sort of bless him, so
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I would come up and he'd give me a script and I would say, all right, folks, we got to get behind, A or B or C or D or whatever. Yeah.
Dick, I got two quick questions for you. One, to your knowledge, going back to the mid 80s, and you look back on this now, 30, 40 years later, are you surprised the Dome Stadium was never built there in the late 80s? That's my first question. I'll let you answer first.
No, I don't think so, because there were, I think, the cost of this a Dome Stadium, as I recall, would have been 50% more, maybe double the cost of a stadium without a dome. And the question was, and this is a question that I think maybe Bobby Brown said, he said, look, you're gonna build this not for the season, but for a dozen games or 15 games, right? And everybody thinks, well, it's going to be wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Playing in a dome stadium is not a favorite place for players to play. And I don't know how widespread that. This may be the first time I've ever even acknowledged that conversation with the then American League president. But I think that kind of thought was on the minds of a lot of people, and around the country. Seattle, a Dome Stadium is really important. But if you're in Pittsburgh or you're in Cleveland, come on, we're tough. We can put up with it. We can put up with it.
What we know now, being that it's been almost 30 years of having Progressive Field and having the Browns back since the late 90s, and our mindset now, and trying to take that mindset and take it back almost 40 years ago. We'd like to, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I mean, these decisions are functions of time and place. What the local economy was doing, how strong were the business leaders, and so on, to make certain things happen.
Yeah, a lot of variables, that's for sure. And you know what, Dick, it's funny because the Browns want a new stadium now. So they're doing the legwork now, because that lease of that stadium, First Energy Stadium's coming up in a few years. And the Cavs just got a renovation at their arena. The Indians are going to be starting a brand new renovation at Progressive Field that will start at the end of this upcoming season that will last 3 years. So the topic of stadiums and domes here in Northeast Ohio will continue.
It will continue. And let me just say, especially on the lakefront.
Dick Celeste, a wealth of knowledge, former governor of Ohio and a Lakewood High School alum, Cleveland native. Thank you so much for joining us here on Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast. Scott and I had a great time chatting with you about a topic that we both find very fascinating.
Thanks. It's a stroll down memory lane for me, and I appreciate it. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, our next guest, Tom Chema, an appointed executive director of the Gateway Project, which we all know now as Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse in Progressive Field. He's coming up right after this. Don't go anywhere. 1980s, 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, 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 1990
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
What's up, everyone? Chase Smith here, host of the Chase Smith podcast, and my podcast reflects who I am. My hobbies, my interests, my passions, my curiosities, my careers, my questions, and my family. I'll spend time talking about all types of sports, movies, TV shows, trending news stories, and other cultural events, and even faith. This is who I am, and I hope I can get to know you as well. Join me on the Chase Smith podcast, and let's have some thought-provoking conversations, only on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hey, I'm Jason.
And I'm Gary, and we love ball cards.
And if you love ball cards too, good news. You just found your new favorite podcast. From breaks to grading.
And from collecting to flipping, join us on the Ball Card Show.
The sports podcast for the sports collector.
We continue our stadium discussion today with a gentleman who was in the middle of the early 90s resurgence of the downtown Cleveland sports venues many of us nowadays take for granted. He was the executive director of the Gateway Project back around 1990. Of course, now we know Gateway as Progressive Field and the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. He was also the former president of Hiram College, among a whole bunch of other ventures that he was involved with going back to the 70s and into the 80s prior to Gateway. Joining us today is Northern Ohio native, Mr. Tom Chema. Tom, it's great to have you on our podcast. How are you today?
I'm terrific, Scott. Thank you and John for inviting me to participate.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on here. And there's a lot of interesting points and news and facts about what happened years ago that people don't know about, and we're hoping that you could shed some light on it for us. So thank you for coming on.
It seems like we always end up talking about a new stadium. You know, the Browns came back in the late 90s. The old stadium, sat there for a couple years. And, whether it's a new stadium, whether it's a dome stadium or some derivative of that topic, it seems like it always occurs, especially when the weather gets bad. We have great facilities here in 2023. There's talk now, obviously, of replacing the Browns stadium, but it wasn't always that way, having two great facilities. Can you take us back even long before your involvement with Gateway, back to the 1970s and 80s? What was the stadium landscape like here in Cleveland? What was the vibe that everyone had back then?
Well, it is interesting when you go back to the 70s. The 70s were sort of a pivotal time in the Perk administration. The old Cleveland Arena more or less fell apart on Euclid Avenue, and a new building was built, and the city and the owners of both the basketball team and the two hockey teams could not come to any agreement. So a decision was made to build what became the Coliseum out in Richfield. And the owner of the team at the time thought that Cleveland was going to continue to expand south and Akron would expand north and he would be right smack in the middle. Well, that didn't exactly happen that way. And he found himself with a building out in the country. And coincidentally, the city of Cleveland wanted to get rid of its obligations for running Municipal Stadium, which was where the Browns played and the Cleveland Indians played. And so the city leased the stadium to an entity called Stadium Corporation, which was controlled by Art Modell. And it was a very good deal for Mr. Modell, but a lousy deal, as it turns out, for the Cleveland Indians. The base rental, as I recall, was about $250,000 or $260,000 a year to the city. But the Browns, or Stadium Corp, turned around and leased the municipal stadium on the lakefront to the Indians for in excess of $1 million, and then a share of concessions, a share of a share of everything. The Indians thus were in a position for the next 20 years where they could not make money. I mean, it was virtually impossible for the Indians to economically do well. And that certainly showed up on the field. They weren't able to pay players. They might get some good people like Joe Carter and Andre Thornton and et cetera, but they couldn't keep them very long, and they couldn't keep a nucleus very long, even though there were obviously some very great, cool players during that era, but we didn't win. I think in a 30-year period, there were 29 losing seasons, and they lost money virtually every year. Fortunately for the Indians, in the mid-'80s, the Jacobs brothers acquired the team, and they were intent upon making a change. By this time, the Cleveland Municipal Stadium was not in very good shape. No one, whether it was the city or Stadium Corp, had put any money of any consequence into either renovating or upkeep in that building. And for those old enough to remember going there, it was an experience.
Sure was. Tom, you talk about how the Indians didn't make any money during that time until the Jacobs bought them. There were rumors, and legit rumors, that there was potential where the tribe was going to move out of the state and do a different city. And there was a lot of different potential, locations lined up that were rumored around. To your knowledge, before the Jacobs bought it, how legit were those rumors, and what did you hear about that during that time?
Well, prior to the mid-'80s, I don't think while there were always rumors, I don't really think there were any serious issues about the team moving, because most of the ownership were committed Cleveland people, the Ted Bondas of the world. So I don't think that was an issue. But by the time the Jacob brothers come along, those rumors are much more serious. Not that the Jacobs weren't committed to Cleveland. They obviously were, and they proved that. But it was increasingly clear that if the team was going to be in any way competitive, it needed a new venue. And so there were a lot of people, particularly in Southwest Florida, promising a new venue. And so those rumors were real, and there were pressures actually externally on the Jacobs brothers to move the team to Southwest Florida.
What was your role as an executive director, and what did you do specifically during that time?
In 1989, Dick Celeste was governor of Ohio, and he was in the last year or so of his administration, and he approached a small group of us. I had been in his cabinet until about a month before this happened, but he approached a small group of Clevelanders and said, "Hey, what do I do in my last year or 2 years for Cleveland?" And I claim that it was Mary Boyle. She claims that it was me. But one of the two of us, or both of us, suggested to the governor that the biggest thing he could do for Cleveland was to save the Indians. He mulled that over for a little bit and came back and asked me if I would help him put together a plan to save the Indians. And he quickly realized that he couldn't be out front in this, that his role had to be absolutely behind the scenes. So I was the front person, and I spent from roughly June of 1989 through December of 1989 very quietly trying to get support from the political space, mayors, members of council, county commissioners, state legislators, as well as the business community and the media, for an effort to build a new stadium. It very quickly became clear to me that if we didn't build a new stadium, we were going to, in the relatively near future, lose the Indians. So I, in that summer, concocted this plan to ask the people of Cuyahoga County to impose a tax on beer, wine, cigarettes, and alcohol that would be the mainstay, the principal support financially for constructing a new facility. Our initial thinking, it didn't last very long, but the initial thinking was that this would be a multi-use building that would be for both the Browns and the Indians. But Art Modell very quickly decided that he didn't want to play. Well, that's not exactly true. What Art said to us was, I will be in if I can have the same deal in this new stadium that I have in Cleveland Municipal Stadium. But that sort of defeated the purpose here, what we were trying to accomplish. So he bowed out. And I actually think that was a great decision by Modell, because we ended up with a baseball-specific stadium, I think a true architectural icon for downtown Cleveland. And if we had tried to do back in the early 90s, a multi-sport facility with baseball and football, we would not have nearly the iconic structure that we developed. So when he bowed out, we switched gears a bit and pursued Gordon and George Gund and tried to convince them to move the Cavs downtown. And eventually, by the spring of 1990, we had succeeded, and they agreed to participate in the project. And so the Gateway project became more than just a stadium. It was a ballpark and an arena. And I've wandered here, but your question was my role. My initial role as a volunteer was just to come up with this plan and to try to sell it to the political community. And I can go into chapter and verse about what had to happen there. But once we passed the sin tax, once the public agreed to pass that tax on beer, wine, cigarettes, and alcohol, I tried to get people to refer to that as a luxury tax, but that didn't work. The plain dealer dubbed it a sin tax, and it stuck. And so we had to deal with that politically. But once the tax had passed in May of 1990, having gotten the governor, the mayor, the county commissioners, everybody and his brother out on a limb, they decided I would be out on the limb with them. And we created this entity called the Gateway Economic Development Corporation of Greater Cleveland, which was responsible for building the facilities. And I was named the executive director. So I was the CEO of that not-for-profit entity, which still exists. And I was responsible from soup to nuts, putting together the funding, the financing, doing the leases with the Cavs and the Indians, selling the naming rights, ultimately deciding who was throwing out the first pitch. Everything was ultimately my responsibility. I reported to a board. The Gateway Board of Trustees was a great group of people, initially headed by a man named Pat Parker. He was the first chair, and he was there for about a year plus. And then Jim Bigger came on board, and Jim shepherded the project as chair of the board from late 91 through 95. Both Pat and Jim have subsequently died, but they were terrific bosses to have, and the entire Gateway board were great people. Half of them, or 4, were appointed by the city, 4 trustees were appointed by the county commissioners, and the 9th was a joint appointment of the mayor and the chairman of the board of county commissioners at the time.
So how do you think the landscape and your approach would have been different if Art Modell wanted to play ball and he wanted to be a part of the project under your terms? I mean, I know we're doing this, this imaginary future, but let's say he was a little more less stubborn and he was willing to play ball. How would things have changed, at least initially, for you and the beginning of the Gateway project?
Well, it would have added another. It would have been more difficult, frankly, because instead of negotiating with just the Jacobs brothers for the ballpark piece, we would have been negotiating with Modell and Jacobs for that facility, we probably would not have had the arena in place, and that would have been a real loss, in my judgment. A terrific plus from Modell saying no was that we turned to Gordon Gund and said, please come downtown. That building, which hosts a couple hundred events a year, together with the ballpark that hosts 80 plus events a year, that makes it a year-round draw for this quadrant of downtown. And it was that draw that allowed for the upsurge in housing downtown Cleveland, in nightlife, in bars, restaurants, even retail in downtown in the Gateway District. That would not have happened just with a dome stadium for football and baseball.
So to follow up on that, Tom, what year did Art Modell say no?
That would have been fall of 89.
89. Okay.
89.
Wow. Okay.
Wow. Okay. So when he said no at that point in time, you think about it, 6 years later, he moves the team to Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think his next pivot point would have been after he said no? And then Jacob Sealed plans were in Gateway and, the Gund Arena were going into effect. That 6 year period, what was he doing to try to, obviously moving the team wasn't in his vision at that point, but was he just hoping something else would have happened during that 6 year period before the inevitable?
Well, he's deceased, so we can't ask him. And I don't want to suggest that I was a confidant of his, because that was not true. I was not. I was on the other side of the table from him from time to time. But I think what was going through his mind, frankly, in the early period, in the 1989-90, is he thought we would fail. He did not believe that we would be able to build the new facilities, and he would continue to have the Indians as a tenant in Municipal Stadium. I think that was his initial belief. In fact, I know that when we sold 150 suites in the new facility for the Indians, he was totally flabbergasted. He did not believe that could happen. He said this. He thought that people bought suites in Municipal Stadium for the Browns, and the Indians were a throw-in. And he did not believe that he would lose any of his customers once we had this new building in place. So first, I think that he didn't think we would succeed in ever getting the buildings built. And there were a lot of people in Cleveland who shared that view at the time. Secondly, he didn't think that it was going to hurt his business any. And then after that, his thinking evolved into something else. By 94, between the time the ballpark opened in April of 94 and the arena opened in October of 94. In that interim, Art went to Mayor White and asked for the city's assistance in renovating the old stadium. So his attention turned to renovation of the old stadium sometime in 94.
Sounds like he underestimated your guys' plan and the city's plan to get the Indians and Cavaliers a new facility. And once he saw it built and saw the influx, I'm saying this, my opinion, saw the influx of attendance and the draw in a short amount of time, to me, it sounds like he panicked a little bit and was like, okay, we need to get something done now. And it was maybe, is this fair to say, too late in the process in 94 for him to go to then Mayor Michael White about, hey, we need to renovate it. And then probably not enough money in the city to do something like that, couldn't come up with a deal. And then yada, 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 year down the road, he moves the team.
Sort of. Yeah, I think that's largely accurate. I think he knew that it would be difficult immediately for the city to turn around after having spent 460. Well, the city didn't spend any money, honestly. The city didn't spend any money. The county spent money. The city didn't spend any money. The city made money on the Gateway project. That is a little known fact, but it's true. I think Modell wanted to renovate the stadium, and he believed that he had a plan for renovation, and he actually engaged the same architectural team that were our architects on the ballpark portion of our project, a company called HOK, to do a plan for him that he presented to the mayor, and the mayor in turn presented to me and my team at Gateway and asked us if we would stay on board and help with that plan. When I analyzed Art's plan, I came to the conclusion that it was not very sensible from an economic point of view. The plan fundamentally did three things. It improved the suites, put in a new scoreboard, and he wanted to remove a lot of the poles using a cantilever technology that were in the lower seating deck so that the people would have better views for the game. There used to be a joke that the only place where there were more poles than Warsaw was Cleveland Municipal Stadium. In any event, that's what his base plan was. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but not much. And when I analyzed that, he wasn't going to make any more money on that. And if you're going to spend money renovating a stadium or building a new stadium, you want to have a facility that is going to generate substantially more cash than when you started. Otherwise, why do that major capital outlay? And his plan did not do that. Tried to convince him of that. A civic group was put together that was headed by the late David Hogue. A fellow named Joe Roman and I were the staff to that committee. We were also on the committee. And we tried to convince Art that he should sit back and wait for a couple years and we would build a new stadium after the public absorbed the Gateway project, after the public really saw the value of Jacobs Field and Gund Arena. It turns out the public got that very, very quickly. By 95, we barely won the election that approved the syntax. I think 51.2% of 40 something. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but it was a very tight election. We only won one out of what were then 21 wards in Cleveland. The public was very, very split on this. And even those people who voted for it, I think there were a lot of skeptics even among them. But by the time we get to 95, the ballpark and the arena are a success, and a success architecturally. It was a success on the field and on the court, and it was doing the economic spin that we predicted it would. And so I think even as early as 95 or 96, the public would have bought into a plan. And as we know, after Modell left, the public did buy into a plan to put public money into a new football stadium. I think all of that could have been avoided, and it's really unfortunate that it wasn't.
So real quick on this same topic, Scott, I know you want to jump in here.
Go
Tom,
ahead.
is it safe to say, knowing that, and you and your committee talked to Art and said, hey, be patient with this, let's just see what happens here in the next couple of years? He clearly, did he disagree? Because he got impatient and then moved the Browns.
Yeah, he didn't agree. Sometimes I tend to push ahead and get a little over my skis. So in regard to the football stadium, I was there a little bit over my skis and I got reined in by the mayor a bit. But I went out and got an option from the Norfolk Southern Railroad, which is in the news a lot today for other things, but they owned a 78-acre parcel across the street from the main entrance at Carnegie in Ontario to Jacobs Field. And when I say I, not me personally, Gateway Economic Development Corporation had an option to build a football stadium on that site. And I talked Ellerby Beckett, which was the firm that designed our arena, Gund Arena, into doing a freebie for me and doing what's called a fit plan, just to show that a stadium a 79,000 seat building could fit on the site. And I showed that to Art and his team, gave David Modell, and Art did not come on the tour, but gave a tour of the site and showed how this would fit. I had the architects there, and David and Jim Bailey and the Modell team, the Browns team, were there, but they weren't buying what I was selling.
Wow. Go ahead, John.
No, Scott, you're going to ask the same exact question I am. I know it.
I know. And my question is, are there any renderings of that freebie? Is there any renderings of that still in existence?
I don't know. Probably. I don't control the documents of the Gateway Economic Development Corporation, so I honestly don't know whether there are. But there was such a rendering. It was a fit plan. It was not design of a stadium. It wasn't intended to be design of a stadium.
Right.
It was just design. Show that the building could fit on the site and what sort of the views of the stadium would be, and views out of the stadium.
So they were really dead set on renovating the old stadium. They wanted to keep it down there. They didn't want anything. It seemed like they just wanted to distance themselves. What year? What was this? I'll call it a freebie. What year was this? Was this around 91, prior to the beginning?
Oh, no. This is 94, 95.
Oh, okay. After. Okay.
Yeah. This is much. Wow. This is sometime after the ballpark opened. Art went to Mayor White with his plan to renovate, and this was after that.
Gotcha.
So it was 94, late 94, early 95. I've forgotten exactly when, but that would be the time frame. Yeah, Art would say things to us like, "Oh, my children grew up in that building. I love that building. I don't want to move. I just want to renovate it. With all these memories, all these great players, Otto Graham and Jim Brown, and da-da-da-da." But economically, that was just not a reasonable approach.
Where is that land and that site that you're referring to? Is that right south of Progressive Field? The reason I'm asking, I'm just curious because I'm currently looking at Google Maps and trying to figure out where that is now, because I'm trying to find where that railroad would have gone through.
If you look at Google Earth now, you'll have a difficult time really lining it up, because the Interbuilt Bridge was rebuilt, and as it was rebuilt, it came right through where the stadium would have been.
Yep.
Now, this is another, I think, unintended, not so great consequence of not doing the stadium at that site. When the Interbuilt Bridge had to be replaced, if we had built the stadium there, they would have rebuilt the bridge further to the south, and I think we would have had a much more attractive bridge.
Yep.
We have a very utilitarian bridge. I happen to like bridges, I have the Brooklyn Bridge and the Roebling Bridge, and I don't know whether you've seen, there's a bridge over the Ohio River between Steubenville and Weirton, West Virginia, that is great. There's a bridge in Toledo that is terrific. We don't have a bridge like that in Cleveland. We should have a bridge over the Cuyahoga that looks like that is iconic like that, and we don't. But if we had built the stadium the football stadium where I think we should have built the football stadium, there would have been a force to push the Interbuilt Bridge to the south a bit, and there would have been an opportunity to do something way more iconic.
Yeah, basically for our listeners, that is south of Progressive Field, south of Carnegie, and you're looking at probably around the streets of Ontario, the south section of East 9th near Orange Avenue, right?
Yeah,
and
it's
near the river.
Yeah, think of it between Orange Avenue and the river.
Yeah.
At some point, we're going to have to replace Progressive Field and Quicken Loans, not for a while, not for, I hope, a long while. Those buildings were designed to be built for 50 years, and hopefully they'll last longer. The way the Indian/Guardians ownership, the Jacobs and now the Dolans have treated that building, they've done a marvelous job in maintaining the building, the structure, and putting money into, there's a lot of people get upset with the Dolans for not spending money on one thing or another, but they have done a great job of actually maintaining the structural integrity of that facility. And it's going to last for quite a long time yet. And the same thing is true with Dan Gilbert and his predecessor, Gordon Gunn, with the arena. They've done a magnificent job.
So back in the mid-late 80s, you touched on this too, that, you had the Dome Stadium Corporation, you had multiple proposals to build a dome stadium. In fact, what kind of precipitated my brother and I's venture down the road of stadiums was, I have a whole bunch of information here that I actually found in a filing cabinet at the station, and their press releases in great condition. They were probably in Dick Goddard's filing cabinet because he saved everything. But it's the Civic Committee to develop the Dome Stadium. This was back in like 85, and press releases. I mean, it was really well done, outlining all these sites. Judging by at least the presentation, it looked like it was going to be something that was going to have some legs to it. And like we've talked about, it didn't. It fell apart. The public voted it down. Did this cast a huge shadow when you started getting involved with the Gateway project, looking back and realizing that in the last 5 years, this didn't work? Did that influence you at all in going in your direction?
Absolutely. I knew that a property tax was not going to work. So that was a non-starter. I had to come up with something that was very different than the property tax. And as I mentioned before, most of the public officials were very, very wary of becoming partisan supporters of a stadium of any sort or a ballpark of any sort because of that prior experience that they had. So that did instruct us both on how we needed to try to protect the political leadership on the one hand, bring them along at the same time, and come up with a funding mechanism that was not a property tax or anything that smelled like a property tax.
You've talked about taking risks, professionally, and your career is in the public utilities telecommunications arena. And now, back 30 years ago, you were involved with Gateway. Can you talk about the importance, and this is a little bit of a deviation from our topic here, but about taking risks professionally? And, here you are, years later, you're still taking risks. Can you expound upon that and how important that is?
Well, that's sort of been the hallmark of my career, to be honest with you. I have just been fortunate sort of to be in the right place at the right time. I've been asked to do a variety of different things. The Gateway project came along, and again, I knew it was not economically going to do for me what I could do practicing law, but it was an important opportunity to contribute to the community. It was a risk, and I think it has paid off wonderfully for the community and for me personally. As a result of that, I can run around the country now because after I left Gateway Corporation, I started a consulting firm, and we have been involved in what are now, I think, 46-ish buildings around the country, and I can show my children and grandchildren all these buildings that I had a role in. So, it's personally satisfying, as even if not horribly lucrative. But I think it's important to be willing to take risks. And unfortunately, I'm going to go beyond our scope here, I suppose, but I think one of our problems as a community, as a whole, is we are so risk averse. If you don't count the Hilton Hotel as part of the convention center project, if you count that as a separate project, the Gateway project to this minute is still the largest dollar-wise project, public type project that we have done in Cleveland. That was only $461 million. That's a drop in the bucket compared to today's numbers and projects. And that it's silly that that's the case. But we aren't willing to take risks. But I don't know what it is in the water here that causes us not to be willing to be more aggressive and take more risks. We need to. Other communities do. And we would benefit all of our citizens in a way more inclusive economy if we were willing to take some greater risks.
Well, I think when you talk about city development, and Tom, when you talk about the new stadiums and the plans, sometimes you have to take risks, and unfortunately, some cities, like you say, don't do that. We'll see what happens here with the current Brown Stadium, what they decided to do. But Scott and I want to thank you so much for coming on our podcast and shedding some light on those early 90s Gateway projects, as you were the former executive director, instrumental in getting Progressive Field, then Jacobs Field, and then Gun Arena, now Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse completed, and also some intriguing stories in relationship there with Art Modell. So Tom, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time with us today.
Happy to do it. A lot of stories about Gateway that I could tell, but a few more people have to die before I do it.
That sounds awesome. There.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tom. Have a great day, and maybe we'll talk to you later on down the line.
Thank you.
John, that is a whole lot of information right there. It's interesting to see how even now, when you talk with people that are involved with the project that occurred the Dome Stadium Corporation almost 40 years ago, you can still kind of sense it's still a little, I don't want to say touchy, but it's still fresh on a lot of these guys' minds. And we only talked to two people, and there are a lot more people involved with that we couldn't get a hold of. And unfortunately, some people have passed. So it's still fresh in their minds, maybe not in ours, but in theirs.
It's interesting how politics, and Tom and Dick both kind of alluded to it, politics plays a lot of roles in trying to get things developed, obviously in the real world, but also in sports, and trying to get new facilities. We're seeing it now in Cleveland with the Browns. We saw it then too. So it is very, very fascinating what went down and what didn't ever materialize. And some of the same issues that they faced back then, they're still facing now. Not just here in Cleveland, it's all over the country when it comes to financing a new professional sports building.
So I talked with Vince Campanella. Talked with him on the phone. He didn't want to come on the podcast, but he was more than gracious with his time talking with me on the phone. He was the Cuyahoga County Commissioner back in 1980, in the mid-'80s, I think it was 1984, 85, who was really pushing for the Dome Stadium. And basically what he said was politics got in the way, and there were a lot of agendas, even people in the same political parties. One person wanted to go this direction, another person wanted to go in this direction, because they knew that if they went in this direction, someone else would follow suit, and there are a lot of butting heads. And he said if it weren't for that, they would have made a lot more headway. Now, of course, it didn't pass ultimately because of the way it was funded with property tax. And of course, the public didn't like that. But he said the politics got way in the way with that. And it just, it kind of got off the ground, but it probably didn't get up above 2 or 3 feet, to use that metaphor. So he was the guy too, John, that when I was talking to him, there were things that he still didn't want to talk about. And I didn't push the issue with him. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So that's kind of a telltale sign right there.
Scott, it's funny that he said that to you, because Tom Chema kind of said it to us just a moment ago. I'll tell you more stories of the Gateway project, but more people have to die.
Right. I'm like, ooh.
Of course, he's joking, but it's just the politics still run deep. And, it's just very, very fascinating. A little slice of Cleveland sports history that I think many of our listeners had never heard of. And I only heard about this when you brought it up to me years ago. And then when you wanted to do this topic for this episode, you did the legwork and got those two guys lined up. And I learned so much about it. So
really, and the other thing too, follow us on on Twitter. I'm sorry, when you tweeted out where the link is, There'll be a lot of other pictures, because what I have here is the press releases from 1985. I found them in an old filing cabinet, and they really go into all of the sites, the prospective site. There were 14 sites, John, in this that they thought about putting a stadium back in 1985. So all those pictures will be put on social media, so you can kind of check that out. Try to give you some perspective on what the Dome Stadium was and why it didn't happen.
And of course, that Twitter account, our Twitter account for this podcast, at Sabol Brothers. Once this goes live, which it already is, if you're listening to it, just log on to Twitter. You can see some of those pictures we'll have up there for you, as well as some of those plans. Very fascinating stuff, because the Browns have looked at sites currently, and now it looks like they're looking at continuing to keep as it sits now today here in late April of 2023, their current stadium. So we'll see what they do with the renovations. As always, follow yours truly at John_Sabol.
And you can follow me at Scott Sabol FOX8 on Twitter. Send us messages, comments, concerns. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for listening, everyone, on this fun episode of Sabol Brothers on the Baseline podcast on the failed Cleveland Dome Stadium project. Hope you enjoyed it.